The Escapist, Part 2, written and read by John Miro. Bobby Charter's grandfather had carved the family farm out of a forest over a century ago, a prime piece of northern land with a creek running through it and acres of forest all around the small barn and modest family home, hiding it all from prying eyes. When his father inherited the place, he'd carved out a half-dozen acres for tree farming to supplement the meager profits the rotating crops, hogs, and chickens provided. Even more than his father before him, Terry Charter had lived off his land, bled for it, and he cherished his privacy on it. The tree farm business did well enough that Bobby's father could tell the farm corporations and the bankers and the real estate speculators exactly where and how to go pollinate themselves whenever they came calling. Bobby didn't understand why his father shunned the world. Out of earshot, he called the man a survivalist and railed against his stubborn refusal to modernize. There was nothing evil about the municipality's offer to split the cost of installing sewage, water, and gas, Bobby argued. Terry argued right back that offering modern conveniences was just a way to raise his taxes and give inspectors a right to come sniffing around on his property. Terry never budged and remained 20 minutes outside city limits and, as far as his son was concerned, 100 years in the past. Father and son would never settle this argument. Soon, the world made it a moot point instead. Bobby and his father had fought tooth and nail right up until the Christmas break he brought Carly home from college to meet Terry. Bringing her home at all had been a big fight between Bobby and Carly. Right down to the wire before that Christmas vacation, Bobby had refused to introduce her to his father. It had almost broken them up. At the last minute, Carly dropped her ultimatum. If she wasn't good enough to meet his family, she wasn't good enough to date, period. Bobby gave in, and Carly came to meet his father. That wise choice was the only reason Bobby or Carly lived to see the new year. Terry and Carly were forces of nature. They never did see eye to eye, but they loved and respected each other in a way Bobby could never fathom, despite loving them both. Yeah, they were good for each other, Bobby grudgingly acknowledged. His wife and father's presence in each other's lives was the reason his neighbors out here in the middle of nowhere could still farm their own lands instead of long ago losing their deeds to local strongmen, and why his neighbors' kids weren't dying out of starvation or cancers half as much as they were in other parts of the world. True, part of that was because the worst of the Ripper invasion had taken place down south. The other part of it was down to Carly and Terry before him, a mantle Bobby carried for them in their absence. As much as he hated the intractable, paranoid, close-minded side of his father, Terry Charter's stubbornness was the reason Bobby had 15 wonderful years with the love of his life. A whine and a scrape at his calf drew Bobby's attention. Arthur had appeared out of nowhere, like he always did. The German shepherd's lolling tongue and cocked ears spoke as clearly as the Gilson kid's ruckus, telegraphing to Bobby exactly what he wanted from his human. The chores were all done, and Bobby did need something to distract him from wondering what Greg would think if he knew where his inverter repair parts had really come from. "How about it, Mutt? Up for another run?" he asked Arthur. The dog's ears perked up, and Bobby scratched the dog between them. "Sure, a long walk will do us both good." Arthur barked his joy, sprang into the air twice, and ran past the barn, headed full steam for the trees. Bobby looked out past the gate. He spat a gob of phlegm into the air, aiming for the miles-away wreck of the Ripper war machine. Past the barn, his land sloped down to a creek. Before Bobby even started down the patchy, burnt hillock, Arthur was already loping across the old stone bridge beyond. Terry Charter had built that bridge with his own hands, and Bobby had helped him expand it in his teens during a dry season when the creek it crossed had been reduced to a trickle. A rarity back then. Bobby remembered that summer as he climbed to the top of the bridge's arch. He'd been a typical kid, grumbling that the bridge was as solid as 1,000 rocks. Why rebuild the thing? Those 1,000 rocks had been laid in place without mortar, so the weight of each stone supported those above. Expanding the bridge had meant taking it half apart and spending day after baking summer day engaged in back-breaking labor with his father. Since the rippers came, the water under that bridge had almost never rose higher than it had at the top of its ebb that miserable summer, except for the torrential, unpredictable flash floods that destroyed a bridge or two around here every rainy season. The Ripper fleet had decimated Earth's military, tore kilometers-deep holes in the earth, scooped untold amounts of water from the oceans. Cities had been flattened, infrastructure destroyed. The human race had been pounded halfway to the Stone Age before the survivors had figured out how to fight back. Oh, but once clever humanity cracked that nut, within 2 years of their arrival, humanity turned the tide, wiping out more than half the fleet. Mankind chased the surviving Rippers into space and there delivered the killing blows before the enemy could escape. By all accounts, not a single ship escaped, and on a clear night a body could see some of the giant vessels tumbling still in orbit. Once every few years, some ambitious robber baron would knock one back down to Earth, and factions would line up on either side of the crash to fight for what came spilling out. That bounty never made it this far into the country. People in Bobby's part of the world paid a steep tithe to the strong men protecting them from harm, keeping some form of law and order running, but they never got more than marginal peace of mind in return. No, Bobby corrected himself, that wasn't all they got. The last Ripper ship knocked out of orbit had touched off a forest fire down south that burned for 2 years straight. That had driven up the cost of protection and the quota for food production to make up for the losses. Bobby felt the solid rock beneath his feet. He missed his father. He wished he'd appreciated his old man for being as solid as that bridge back when he was still breathing. Terry's end had come quick. The weeks of celebration after the Ripper defeat quickly morphed into a mad scramble for resources, and anyone who was too lucky or too prosperous found themselves the target of a hungry, mindless mob. Terry had been both, of course, but his real sin had been sharing too much. The wrong people caught the scent and came hunting. Bobby could still see the apples fall from his father's hand as the crowd closed in. He shook off the memory and walked off the bridge that would shade this creek for centuries, giving silent thanks to his father. Even if Terry's dying moment had been tragic, they'd saved Bobby and Carly and planted the seeds of the last lesson his father would give him. One about balancing the needs of his neighbors and good Samaritanism against the dangers of a hungry, frightened mob. Despite the gutting memory, Bobby smiled a little as he followed his dog into the thick trees on the far side of the bridge. This was his father's home, and Terry had lived his way and done what he set out to here. Made a home for him and Carly that would last. It wasn't Terry's fault that it took one more death for Bobby to learn all his father had bled to teach him.